2, and 3.
1, 2, and 3. I like that music.
I remember the first time I saw this in a theater, even from this opening frame, you're looking at it going, this is going to be
This
an experience.
is going to be something else, I recall.
Something new.
Yeah.
Is everything in place?
You weren't supposed to relieve me.
Trace program running.
Taking a shift.
You like him, don't you? You like watching him.
There's something in the form of presentation with the quantitative stress, with the numbers presented, that gives you a sense that we're going to have something that shatters the surfaces.
This line is clean.
Yeah, of course I'm sure.
Indeed it does.
Indeed it does. You know, I think in many ways, Ken, we look at this in terms of the epic ambition of the Wachowski brothers, a sense of the whole.
Yep.
In the midst of a global information system. Police right away. Power, surveillance.
Well, and global is going to be a constant theme for us because you really can't understand the Matrix without understanding all three of them together. They're a trilogy. They're a unit.
Precisely. Precisely. And there's almost a sense in which you get Thrasymachus versus Socrates at the very beginning. You got force, might makes power, coercion versus questioning, scrutinizing, interrogating. Can we think for ourselves in a world in which the surfaces are so hegemonic and pervasive?
The surfaces are, and this one surface is about to kick ass. And this is so...
this serious scene,
it is so great.
This serious scene. There's the police right there. Feel like I'm in Southside Chicago, these goddamn police. Shit.
Cramming up your ass. The orders were for your protection. I think we can handle one little girl.
One little girl, yeah.
I sent 2 units. They're bringing her down now. No, Lieutenant, your men are already
Agent
dead.
Smith turns out to be ironic.
There we go.
Yeah.
Music powerful, moving. You know, the role of violence is very important here too, though. As we talked about force and might, but these kind of violent confrontations, which are not just physical, but also psychic, the kind of intellectual violence that's done to us to render us sleepwalkers and not to think for ourselves. And we're going to see this, I think, throughout the trilogy. And you're so right about the synecdochic character,
Yeah.
which is to say the relation of parts to whole. You can't understand the parts without understanding the whole, and understanding the whole is still more than the sum of its parts.
And we're still sitting here right now. We don't know any of that. And we see this thing unfolding before us. And again, it's just astonishing. You're sitting there going, my God, this is outrageous. This is so cool.
That's impossible.
Impossible, exactly. Okay, so we know 2 of them are playing a very different game.
See, when people watched this for the first time in 1999, it just blew minds, you know what I mean?
It's still pretty mind-blowing.
Good God Almighty, and it's still mind-blowing, it really is.
Yes!
That's tough, that's tough, that's tough.
Unwavering, it's like unwavering. Come on, come on.
Just get up.
Poke your
Get
head
up.
through.
There's the telephone.
Yep.
Ooh.
Okay, race between the truck and the phone.
tell you, it's just so gripping. You don't even want to comment too much certain times here. It's so
Absolutely.
powerful, you know?
Absolutely.
Wow. And it's so multi-layered, you know. I think it's very important for people to recognize the levels of meaning, the richness of meaning.
Well, particularly as you're saying, when we look at the trilogy as a whole, entirely different meanings start to come out. And I know you and I want to talk about that as we go along and probably not say too much about it right now. But boy, does it get rich and multi-layered.
Begins to unravel in unpredictable ways.
Love that shot. What an opening. What an opening.
Global search again. Heath, London.
One of the, as you know, we both share an interest in spirituality in all its many forms, among many other things. One of the great motifs throughout the world's great wisdom traditions is we're in a world of illusion, but we can wake up to a greater reality. And there's nothing, I think this is one of the great opening sequences indicating that there's something going on out there. And particularly when Trinity leans over and says, wake up.
What I love, though, about the Matrix is the kind of skeptical dimension in which there are pseudo forms of awakening and there's more convincing forms of awakening. So what you think you're awakening to may in fact be another species of illusion. And it may be illusions all the way down, turtles all the way down, as Bertrand Russell put it.
And of course we have the white rabbit, yeah, the famous white rabbit, Alice in Wonderland.
You think of Wittgenstein's rabbit, too, in philosophical investigations, where, in fact, what you think is a rabbit may not be, or is and not at the same time. Thank God for Ludwig.
Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall.
Now, what song was that from, no?
Jefferson Airplane.
Jefferson Airplane, wasn't it? Sure,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. I remember that. We didn't play that as much on my side of town as I would like, but I did hear it on the radio. You know what I mean? 101, the one. Capital O or small o?
Well, it's also Wake Up 101.
Yes,
This is
That's right. Introductory class 101.
Enlightenment 101.
101.
Yeah.
Usually textbook versions that don't cut too deep.
You're my savior, man. My own personal Jesus Christ.
You get caught using that.
Reference to Jesus Christ right away.
Yeah.
I like that redhead too. You know, reminds you of the characters in Walter Scott novel. Always kind of offbeat, full of a lot of passion, transgressive.
Here's his
You
comment.
have that feeling where you're not sure if you're awake or still dreaming.
Back to Descartes, 1641, Meditations. Only way to fly.
Yeah.
Sounds to me like, you need to unplug, man.
Unplug. But it's very interesting because it's true that drugs, sexuality are forms of transcendence. There are ways in which a certain kind of awakening does take place, but it's different kinds of awakening that one often has in mind in terms of deeper spiritual forms.
Well, then, and Cornel, why don't you also give us your riff? Because somebody who, talking about awakening, somebody named Trinity is about to deliver the second wake-up call. What's your Trinity? What's your take on the name?
Well, one, of course, is that Trinity itself is non-biblical. You don't find it within the scriptures of the world historic religions, but at the same time, it's a doctrine concocted and created in order to make sense of the complex meanings that flow from the various narratives of the scripture, so that you keep track of the three different dimensions of the Godhead.
Right.
And of course, you've got the issue of gender here, where of course Trinity you would think has to do with the first, which is God the Father, as it were, and then the Son, and then the third, which is Holy Spirit, which has always been androgynous because it can cut across it. Gender bending, it's hard to define the particular meaning of a Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit within the Christian tradition, for example.
I'll give you another really quick example. In Buddhism, there is a trinity as well, and it's that the awakened one, Gautama Buddha in this case, is said to have three bodies. It's a trinity, or trikaya, three body. And the bodies are body, mind, and spirit, and they're taken to be the three dimensions of the awakened one. And I think what we find in the Matrix, there really is that kind of trinity as well, because Zion, the Matrix, and the machines represent a certain kind of trinity that need to be awakened. And that's what I think is we're going to get them, Cornel.
Problem with authority. Now, we had mentioned before the Socratic energy that's being unleashed by this, not just individual film, but the trilogy as a whole. And Socratic energy has to do with contesting authority, being deeply suspicious of authority, trying to undermine the assumptions and presuppositions upon which authority is predicated. And this process, which is an endless process, it's an incessant process, but it goes step by step and stage by stage. And at the very beginning now, we get the staging of what happens when one initiates a process of awakening in which you render various authorities relative. You begin to contest and call into question those various authorities. And this is, in some ways, almost a archetypal moment. This corporate...
There's something wonderful about FedEx delivering the means of your enlightenment. There's some joke
the
in there.
Contradictory character of it all.
Exactly.
Hello?
One of the great things that does happen in the various wisdom traditions is waking up, or enlightenment, or liberation is a crucial key component to these great paths of spiritual awakening. The Matrix isn't just about spirituality, but I think, as we'll see as we go on and watch all three of them, there's an unmistakable component represented by light and represented by waking up and representing by liberation and redemption. And what's so astonishing to me is that right here at the beginning, the call of the entire...
You see, this is very interesting. The police behind, the repressive forces behind, and the public face of
Well, and keep in mind,
culture.
It's just as you're saying, that there really is deception within deception, because as the trilogy unfolds, Smith takes on a very, very different meaning.
Oh, yes.
Almost representative of light towards the end. So even here, things are not what they seem.
That's right. That's right. But we don't want to downplay the political dimension of this film. No, that this is a critique of corporate capitalism on a global level, with forms of surveillance and repressive forces behind that surveillance, and the individual seemingly dwarfed, seemingly rendered impotent and powerless, and yet still trying to see whether there's some possibility of heroic agency in such a corporate capitalist world.
As Frederick Jameson might say.
Brother Fred, indeed.
Brother Fred, exactly. It is one of the wonderful things about the Matrix, and what I really love about what the Wachowskis have done in refusing to say what their interpretation is to leave room for all these multiple levels of interpretation. Everybody has their notion about what the Matrix represents that you want to get out of, that it's good to get out of, and I think there's much truth to many of them. That's part of the fun thing about the whole Matrix trilogy.
I think that's true for any great work of art that is polyvalent. It's subject to multiple interpretations that go a variety of different directions.
Yeah, it makes it very rich, and all sorts of different folks can then relate to it at different levels, different dimensions.
But there is this paradox, though. He's in the process of being awakened, and yet he's still taking orders from Morpheus. So what Morpheus appears as if he's an agent of awakening, but he could easily become just as dogmatic as the very thing that he's rebelling against.
Which is one of the things, as this unfolds, you can indeed interpret some of his actions later as being just that.
Absolutely. Well, that's part of the skepticism. See, I think there's just a skeptical bug shot through the souls of the Wachowskis that they can never resolve. There's an inescapable ambiguity and ambivalence, even in their own quest to deal with illusion versus reality. There's a meta view there. Surveillance of the surveillance room.
That's the architect's view. When the person says, "We've been watching you," the architect is part of the omniscient watcher of this. And that's why the Matrix isn't quite what it seems to be, even from the beginning.
Well, you've got the watchers of the watchers. That's that meta level where...
Now here's where the two...
Well, that's very interesting, the significance of that.
The other life is lived in computers, where you go by the hacker alias Neo and are guilty of virtual...
Thomas Anderson and Neo.
We have a law for.
See, on the one hand, we've got a cog and a corporate machine. Software, of course, in the 80s, the major avant-garde enterprise in the capitalist world. And on the other hand, you've got Neo, who's the one who is in the process of awakening, with the possibility of actually making awakening a popular activity, convincing others to engage in the process of awakening. Or is that going to be another kind of illusion?
Most dangerous man alive.
There's really a very complex interaction between Agent Smith and Neo throughout all three of the films. Agent Smith becomes an agent of Neo's own liberation at some point. It's the connection between those two in that third film that explains a lot of what's going on. And that's why I think your point about be skeptical of the skepticism even is that things are not what they appear. We don't know what's going on, and for the first time what we're going to see in a moment is something that should not be happening. In other words, there's going to be a space-time meltdown when he can't open his mouth. And all of a sudden you're looking at that and you're going, okay, wait a minute. Perceptions here are reality. And all of a sudden some very different perceptions are creeping up here. What is going on?
One of the questions I would want to raise, even directly to the Wachowskis themselves, is how they would account for the source of that kind of transgression and defiance in this, on the one hand, ordinary person, Anderson, right, and Neo on the other, because there seems to be a certain kind of voluntarism, this active will that's always already programmed into human beings, such that they will defy authority, they will transgress against authority. And where does that come from?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
You can either account for it theologically in terms of a certain kind of free will, or it could be ideologically in terms of resistance being built into every situation in which structures of domination are pervasive, or it could be American, right, which is just kind of Emersonian will to be nonconformist no matter what, and therefore when you're suspicious of authority, there's always the resources to defy that authority. Polish Catholic as you think about the various forms of authority, from the governments to religious institutions to corporate institutions, all vicious forms of conformity at their worst, coercing individuals to defer. In some ways, that's the fundamental fear of the Wachowskis. They can't stand blind conformity and coercive deference. Just that water itself is symbolic of a certain kind of baptism.
What?
Stop the car.
He's got to be protected from himself.
Jesus Christ, that thing's real!
That thing's real. Now that's very interesting with the play of reality and illusion. But one wonders whether just as a symbol of evil that there's an acknowledgement that the evil is real.
The evil is real, and again, all not quite what it seems. They all kind of go through a change as it unfolds. But at the first film, there's no question. It's almost very dualistic. It's everything in the Matrix is bad, everything out of it is good. And so it's a very kind of black and white film, but all of that becomes extremely complex beginning with the second film, as you know. And we'll talk a lot more about that, I'm sure.
Ways, implicit in the first, but not as
much.
Easily discernible.
And this is one of the great moments, is we meet Morpheus and we get to have this choice.
there's this assumption that something's missing, something's wrong. Now, religiously, people talk about this in terms of certain dissatisfaction with finitude. Christians talk about it in terms of fallenness. What is the source of this intuition that something is missing that Morpheus can appeal to that makes sense to Neo? Is going to be, I think, a very important theme throughout the trilogy, whether one accepts a religious or secular, whether one accepts a theological or a non-religious interpretation of this sense of something's missing, something's wrong.
I agree. And I also think it's important that you'd point out earlier that this can be read on many different levels in terms of even liberation. And I think they're all true in a sense. One is there's a spiritual liberation. You can be liberated from your fallenness or your world of dualism to a world of reality, of awakening, of enlightenment. On the other hand, there are forms of social liberation. You can have in social injustice, gender injustice, racial injustice, and you want to be liberated from that. There are all sorts of liberations that are going on. The crucial point that you brought up that I think is really worth repeating is that we only know that we're somehow trapped or enslaved because there is some form of freedom that we can intuit. If there wasn't a freedom that was there in reality, we wouldn't know we were enslaved. So Morpheus is going to appeal to Neo's intuitive feeling that there's something freer, something fuller, something deeper, something more meaningful. And it has to be a reality or you couldn't feel enslaved. And that's a great point. The one thing I love about this whole scene, though, is the reason everybody gets very quiet during this is you're finally, all of a sudden, you're getting an explanation of what's been happening up to this moment. And it's just chilling, the silence. You watch this thing, it's exquisite. So, of course, we talked to the whole thing. But it's just one of my favorite sequences here, because he's going to just keep kind of telling you a little bit more and a little bit more, and it's wonderful.
For your...
But he's just told him what it is. Isn't that interesting?
As a first approximation, shall we say.
First approximation, you see.
Oh, here comes the famous. Here we go.
Crossing of the Rubicon.
Take both. I mean, that's sort of what we do in the 60s, right?
All I'm offering is the truth. Nothing more.
Look at the
What
reflection.
a great
The
shot.
reflection.
What a great shot.
See, that's just pure filmic art right
Oh,
there.
that is beautiful.
Filmic art to the core. There's the thunder.
Yeah, he must be wondering, okay, what did I take?
There's that telephone again.
Gotta love that.
Oh, that references that Wizard of Oz, an American iconic film. Distinction between reality and illusion, wakening from one's sleep.
They killed Toto, too. The bastards.
And the wizard had no that.
Another great shot. What's real? It's so great, of course, watching it the second or third or fourth time, we, obviously know what's going on, but the beauty of seeing this for the first time is you still don't really know what the Matrix is. You have no idea why space and time can be bent like this. It doesn't make any sense at all, except there's something else going on. And the way this slowly unfolds an introduction into the plasticity of space and time is just exquisite.
Oh, that's so very true. They take so seriously Einstein and Heisenberg and Planck and the other physicists' conceptions of space-time and the film itself.
So of course they're trying to figure out where he is which battery he is in the old power generating system. And it goes through. This is a very Stan Groff perinatal birth sequence, death and rebirth, which is a really interesting sequence. There's actually a lot of psychedelic research on some of these stages. It was fascinating to see them sort of repeat these very accurately. But it's also another exquisite series of shots here.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a rebirth sequence or a really fun fraternity house party. It could be either one of those kinds of. I know it's the first shot, the first glimpse of outside the Matrix. Yeah, this is definitely not Kansas.
The music has a very spiritual resonance to it, as if it comes out of a certain kind of high church tradition.
Well, again, part of remember the strange thing is at the end, Machine City is made of light.
Yeah.
That's again. There's these depths of meaning going on.
That's one of the paradoxes. The role of flesh as opposed to simply body is important here too. I think there's a certain sense in which we're dealing with not just meaning as an abstract set of propositions, but it's something that is fleshified and concretized and embodied.
And we'll clearly have some more critical things to say about the movie. I mean, you just sort of have to in the course of things, but boy, some of these sequences are just breathtaking in terms of the subjective mood they evoke, as well as showing objectively what's going on. We still don't know what the Matrix is at this point if you're watching it for the first time. But man, are you getting an education here, and something just so radically original for cinematic history. It's just astonishing.
And we'd have to bring the Wachowskis in to give us a full account of what's going on step by step here, though. I must say there's a level of intricacy here.
Yeah, we'd have to spend time with them, though, and we don't really want to have to do that.
Oh, yes. This is something. He knows it, the dogmatic certainty.
The dogmatic.
This sense of somehow we no longer even have to hope, so it's not even a question of making certain leaps of faith. That's precisely the thing that the film was going to shatter and demolish, this kind of dogmatic certainty that feeds into a Manichaean view of the world.
Exactly.
Axes of evil versus axes of good. We have a monopoly on the good and others have a monopoly on evil.
Now, Cornel, don't you find this interesting, though, because watching the first film, the first time I saw it, it seems a self-contained unit. Mm-hmm. And it's very like you're saying the first film, although there are all these little hints that we've kind of been pointing out in retrospect, we're kind of pointing out some of them. The first time, basically, you see it, it appears a very simple story. Good versus evil. Everything in the Matrix is bad. Everything out of the Matrix is good. Everybody in the Matrix is enslaved. Everybody out of it is free. The job is therefore to get from inside the Matrix to outside. Morpheus is the guy that's helping to point the way out. Therefore, Morpheus is good. I think one of the reasons some people have a little bit more trouble with the second and the third part is the first one is so simple. As you're saying, so Manichaean, so right out of the book of Zoroaster, simple dualistic good versus evil. But you're pointing out just that Morpheus is already starting to show that a little dogmatic strain in it.
Absolutely.
Not the definition of freedom doesn't include dogmatism. So he's becoming a little bit of an ambivalent figure if we're fine watching it.
You've hit some nails on the head. I think one of the reasons why the first film became a classic was both for the right and the wrong reason.
Totally agree.
Right because of the cinematic genius that was manifest in the film, but the wrong reasons because it fit the old traditional American conception of Manichaean views about good versus bad. And here was one that was Manichaean, but with a cinematic genius. And in fact, the cinematic genius was actually working on a much deeper level in which it was the unsettling that kind of opposition.
Well
it was
put.
Completely calling it into question. And once it was called into question, so many Americans, especially our mediocre critics, they couldn't take it. They couldn't take it. Why don't you keep it simple? Keep it dumb, Wachowski brothers. Why are you going to complicate this thing? We're the imperial leader figure.
Well, that in itself is a bit of an ambiguous term, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Seen her before.
Say, Pop?
Here we go.
I think of Melville's Pequot here, too, with Ahab running the ship, basically a factory, salvific ends and aims, dominating, conquering. And, of course, that is the greatest American novel. That's the great epic effort in American literature, Moby Dick of 1851.
I would quite agree with you on that.
32 years old, Herman Melville. Here come the Wachowski brothers, 145 or 48 years later, a new epic.
Here, for the first time, an explanation of the Matrix.
Back to the fundamental question.
Simulacrum.
This is in reductionist Daniel Dennett's reductionist program, The Philosophy of Mind.
world as it was.
Well, Dennett belongs in the Matrix when we get to that later.
Daniel Dennett is the Matrix. God bless him. He's a brother of mine.
We love him, but
We love him, but
I share your assessment of that, yes.
Living in a dream world.
My God, Los Angeles.
I thought of New York. I guess Wachowski thought of Chicago. Desert of the real.
Yep.
References.
Yep. Beautiful phrase.
Baudrillard's famous Texans, simulation and simulacrum.
One of the extraordinary things, and again, we're kind of giving commentaries based on the fact that we've seen all three and we're rereading, the earlier ones on the basis of this, but interpretation demands a whole context in order to better understand each individual part. What the Wachowskis did after this was a series of really brilliant animated things called the Animatrix. They and several others working on it, but there's one in there called The Second Renaissance, Part 1 and Part 2, which is a cartoon, in a sense, an animated sequence, but it's sort of the prequel to the Matrix trilogy. And they kind of give a whole lot of very telling clues about what really happened in this war that started between men and machines. And a couple of the important ingredients are, they say that the machines were created and imbued with, quote, the pure and uncorrupted spirit. And then it was entirely through what they called humankind's vanity and corruption, that there was a war that was started between them. So again, things aren't quite what they appear here. There's a war between man and machines, not necessarily because the machines are bad, but because of something inherently sinful or corrupt that men and women have done. So that would lead you to believe that there might be a kind of redemption down the road where these are reconciled. And indeed, towards Part 3, there is a reconciliation between the machine city and humans, and that's what's so interesting. But again, they're just giving you the surface intro here, which is what makes it so interesting.
See, what I would emphasize is the dark side of creativity and the dark side of free will, because on the one hand, if, for example, you have a God who creates nature and human beings come back and murder God, Nietzsche gave science, and then undermine the natural order itself by blowing it up, beginning with a bomb, hydrogen bomb, on and on. And then, of course, you got human beings who create machines, and the machines now come back and murder and kill the creators of the machine. You go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in the early 19th century. Something that human beings create comes back to haunt them and create nightmarish conditions for the very persons who created them with aims of making the world a better place. So that there's this dark side, there's destructiveness that's part. Old theme though, control. Reduce complexity to something that's manipulable.
He's going to pop.
But see, I think that particular moment is so arresting because there's a sense in which at our gut level, none of us really want to believe that conception of being human is not either possible or institutionalizable. And so we almost have to puke.
Well, and I agree entirely. And the second part of that is there's a whole thing about, do I want reality or do I want illusion if illusion is happy? And Joe Pantoliano, of course, he chooses, put me back in, give me the steak, give me the wine, I'm going back. So that's another theme we see. Do we want reality if it's harsh or do we want a pleasant illusion? And that's the extraordinary thing. Mental slavery is often self-induced because you choose illusion. It's happier.
No, or at least in the short term.
In the short term, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I think here again we see the paradox of strong belief.
The true believer.
Exactly. It's a wonderful thing because it sustains. It's a dangerous thing because it blinds.
Well put again. Well put again. I couldn't agree with you stronger. And remember, according to the architect, this has happened 6 or 7 times.
That's right. Over and over again. No,
exactly.
it's true. It's first reference to that space.
Yeah. Boy, everybody's got their ideas about the one, don't they?
Absolutely.
Strong belief structures really in play.
And that dogmatism of Morpheus has had such an impact on constituting a whole crew of true believers.
Yep. Yep.
who were quite strong and also blind simultaneous.
Yep. Strengths and weaknesses. And
Strengths.
Here begins one of those great sequences. The whole training here leading up to that unbelievable martial arts demonstration with he and Morpheus is a classic movie moment.
So true.
Well, there's a joke in there we won't get into.
What I like about the Wachowskis is that when they appropriate various aspects, facets, practices of other civilizations and cultures, there is a deep respect for it. So it's not simply an object of exotic amusement, but it's really a way of imbibing one's own sense of who one is, and hence has to go through a certain level of discipline to try to make it a part of who one is.
Yeah, it's a fancy word is hermeneutic, a real interpretive understanding, making it your own and honoring it while you're doing it.
Absolutely.
Not just looking at it like a zoo.
Absolutely. It cuts against the grain of much of the kind of preoccupation with Eastern things in American culture, that here you actually have an attempt to enter that world, to take it seriously on its own terms, and still allow you to be yourself.
That is so exquisite.
Look at that.
I tried that. It took me 4 or 5 weeks to be able to jump that long. It was horrible.
Still, I'm glad you're still in shape, though, Brother Ken. After this scene.
Extraordinary editing, too, of those action sequences. Just to the microsecond, beautifully done.
Back to the voluntaristic theme. Only you can walk through it. See, one of the problems with Morpheus is his conception of freeing one's mind is to overcome doubt and disbelief, as opposed to doubt and disbelief being integral to one's way of being human.
Yeah, that's the
He's
difference
such a
between
goddamn dogmatist, and yet he's
dogma.
very attractive because he provides a confidence and a comfort and a consolation that goes with dogma, you know.
Well, that's the positive part.
He's about to break his cotton-picking neck almost.
Yeah.
Look at this.
I know. I hate
hate
it when that happens. That'll leave a mark.
Cool. Sounds like Barkley, doesn't it? To be is to be perceived.
Well, and that's actually, this is another thing is, we both know the Wachowskis fairly well, and one of the things I really appreciate about what they've done here is dare to put philosophically important distinctions into this movie, but philosophically important distinctions that are important because they're important in real life. They're important to human beings.
Absolutely.
And the idealists were one of the first. There was a big, big change in the way philosophy and science was done, starting around Immanuel Kant and working into the great German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and so on, and all the way up to today's developmental psychologist. And the change is very simple. The naive view is that there's a world out there and that we simply look at it. It's existing out there all by itself. We come along, we perceive it much like a camera would see it. The big change is that consciousness can project and create worlds, that our belief structures, the structures of our mind itself, project much of the phenomena that we see. And under those circumstances, reality is just that. It's not just something lying around out there. It's something that in part is co-created by the mind that perceives it. And this is a vivid, vivid explanation of how that happens. And it also ties in with belief structures. If you're going to have, in a sense, unhealthy beliefs or coercive beliefs or authoritarian beliefs in the bad sense, then you are going to project a world equally nasty and unpleasant and mean. And if you want to free your mind to some degree, then you can help free the world around it. And that's the extraordinary thing, one of the really deep philosophical issues, along with fate and free will, life and death, that this movie has the guts to deal with.
And it shows that philosophical issues are not arcane and obscure. They're actually located at the very center of everyday life, of the quotidian, of the familiar. And so when you read a Barclay on claiming that to be is to be perceived, or Kant concerned about the difference between a mental representation of an object and the object itself, that's not necessarily to lead to a discourse that's far removed and far-fetched from how people live their lives every day, and what the Wachowskis have been able to do, us versus them.
Well, keep in mind...
We hear that rhetoric from D.C. these days, don't we?
Yeah, in truth. keep in mind that the Matrix, though, they're keeping people in it by giving them what they want. So again, there's that secret union between, in a sense, being forced to have something and secretly wanting it anyway. These people might be being controlled, but part of them wants that control.
Oh, absolutely. The ways in which conformity and complacency and cowardice sustain systems, sustain forms of authority. So many cities throughout the country actually believe Matrix was a black film. When you looked at all these black folk in positions of authority, unbelievable status, intelligence, creativity, grace. It was quite rare, atypical for a cyber thriller.
How we doing, Tank?
Well, if you know Larry and Andy, you know how deeply they believe this. I mean, it's wonderful, actually.
You're absolutely right. The humanity of persons right across the board.
Agreed.
Colors, hues, race, class,
Agreed.
sex. Those cellos. Shostakovich.
So good.
Well, that put it on their mind, didn't it?
Jaws, Part 12.
That's interesting. Jesus out of him. He's a Thomas. He's a doubting Thomas.
Another classic icon right there, that bits of information can encode entire worlds. You're looking at an entire world right there in terms of digital bits. Just exquisite.
He's got a nice little streetwise sensibility.
Joe Pantoliano. Love that guy. He was in Bound, you know, the first Wachowski.
Oh, the first
film.
Wachowski. Is that right?
Love Bound. Absolutely love that movie.
He's got a real nice vibe. See that skepticism in his voice?
Say to something like that.
Mm-hmm. What a vocation.
Yeah, you might be the one, but run, brother, run.
Thanks for the drink.
For the drink, but not the advice, you see.
Sweet dreams.
Oh, he's cool. He's cool.
Here you go.
Mr. Reagan.
You know,
Ronald Reagan. Is that a reference to
I know this.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, Ronald Reagan? It's hard to say. Let's see.
Put it in my mouth. The Matrix is telling my brain.
Or are directors having fun with actors?
Yeah, well, that's true.
That's
Yeah,
that's that incredible, one of the half dozen or so really crucial dilemmas, not just philosophical, but it eats right at the core of life itself. If ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. Do we want to choose illusions that make us happy or harsh truths? Now, you know, the standard classic thing is know the truth and the truth shall set you free. In some ultimate sense, there's certainly a lot to that. But in so many other ways, it's just this dilemma. Do I want to know the truth or do I want to be happy in my ignorance? And you were quite right to say in the short term, but boy, how many times we're faced day to day with exactly that decision. Do I want to lift the veil, see the truth, and suffer possibly for it? And the people in the Matrix, that was one of the things that was so striking. The machines apparently have made the Matrix.
But I think Wachowskis do allow for a certain kind of integrity of the narrow and the myopic, which is to say how the malls can actually keep people satisfied even though it's rather empty and hollow. And there's reasons why people still go to the malls. It's not a matter of trashing them, but trying to understand that they are gaining something out of it, even though what they're gaining is very narrow. I think on a deeper level, though, the Wachowski brothers are actually playing off of Dostoevsky's themes in The Grand Inquisitor, that people find the burden of freedom overwhelming. They'd rather have authority, they'd rather have miracle, they'd rather have manipulation of mystery, authorities that tell them what to do. And to cut against that grain, Dostoevsky understood, requires unbelievable will, tremendous energy, and a tremendous sense of courage, to put it crudely.
Many types of unfreedom are freely chosen because yeah.
But that line about denying impulses is going to come back quite strong in the second and third. He's absolutely right about Eros as a child of Penia and Poros, of lack on the one hand, ingenuity on the other. That wonderful moment in Plato's Symposium where you get the conception of desire. And what is the role of desire as human beings vis-a-vis beliefs requisite to keep us coping, keep us enduring and struggling, you see?
Well, the Plato's point as well is in the Symposium and the Republic is there are levels of desire. And the whole point is desire starts with exactly the desire he's talking about, erotic, physical desire, but it rises up to desire for the good, for oneness with everything, for a liberating realization. That again is a theme that runs through the Matrix trilogy.
Absolutely. And yet the Wachowskis have such a deep suspicion of Platonism in the sense that maybe the good is found not by transcending the world of becoming and the world of everyday life, but rather within it. You know, Emerson's remark about to find the miraculous in the common is the invariable mark of wisdom. Now, that's a very Emersonian, very in some ways American at its best, and there's elective affinities between that conception of desire for the good and what we see in Wachowski's films here.
They also weave in Eastern and Western themes because finding a spirit that's both transcendent to the world and fully immanent in it is very, very common in Zen Buddhism, for example, and in Taoism. And one of the real tip-offs is what we're about to see in the Oracle is there's a young boy talking about bending a spoon. That's actually a direct koan from the Zen tradition, and the answer was given by the 6 Zen patriarchs. So we know Larry and Andy are fully aware of these things and are working these themes into the Matrix trilogy itself. Again, a very, very rich kind of reading on what seems to be a simple surface thing. Red woman, sexual desire, red-dressed woman, sexual desire, hot dog. And without denying the hot dog, there are other currents swimming in that stream of desire.
And yet I think there's a sense in which Wachowskis are going to swerve from almost every version of Buddhism I know, which is their attempt to hold on to notions of individuality. And that individuality still has to do with bodies with desires, as well as minds with Socratic energies. And you tell me if I'm wrong, Brother Wilber, but this notion of individuality being inextinguishable for them. That's very Emersonian, very William Jamesian, very American, whereas most Buddhisms that I know are very suspicious of individuality because you're caught in the wheel of desire and therefore you remain enslaved, as it were.
Well, that's certainly true for Theravadan Buddhism, but the larger Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism deny a smaller self only to find a larger, truer self. And that true self, very Emersonian in that sense, that true self both
resistance is sustained by a certain kind of Manichaean view, and yet you need resistance of some sort to remain sane. It's a dilemma. It's a real dilemma. It's the projects, Robert Taylor projects outside of Chicago. All this source of wisdom right there in the hood.
Like trying out for American Idol.
I'm telling you.
You see the rabbits on the TV screen?
Oh, God, I missed that. Is that right?
Yeah. Here's the Zen koan.
Oh, this is what you were talking about? Yes. Let's say more about that, though, brother.
The 6th Zen patriarch was named Hui Ning, and he's thought to be the real originator of Zen. We don't have a lot of sayings from him, but one of the first things that we have is when he was asked, somebody was watching a flag in the courtyard waving, and they said, "What is it that waves, the wind or the flag?" And he said, "Neither the wind nor the flag, but your mind is waving." And again, the whole notion is that mind consciousness can create entire worlds. And when you master your mind, you have mastered the entire universe in that very special sense. And that the awakening that has to occur is an awakening in your own mind, in your own spirit, in your own interiority. And so it's not that when you master your mind, you can make spoons bend. That's sort of a gross oversimplification, but it's when you master your mind, you are one with everything that's arising. So you are the spoon, you are the sun, you are the entire universe and the deepest part of your own being, which is spirit itself. So Zen has always been one of the many ways of awakening where you realize the supreme identity with spirit and therefore with the entire world moment to moment as it's arising. And this is actually a direct quote from one of the Zen teachings.
You're the Oracle?
You gotta love this cigarette smoking, cookie baking mama. Yeah.
Looks like one of my aunts from Louisiana.
There you go.
It's amazing to have black women in this particular role like this. Other positions of authority.
Well, in authenticity, don't you think it's even a better word than authority? It's an authentic voice.
Yeah, well, that's true. She's got a beautiful face.
How did you know?
She does. She's just radiant.
You're cuter than I thought.
Hear that jazz in the background?
You are the one.
Duke Ellington's working on it. Count Basie's working.
The name of that song is I'm Beginning to See the Light. Love it.
It's got that syncopation and rhythm in it.
Yeah.
I would first want to underline that use of the word blindly in relation to Morpheus, because she can see it very clearly. She already knows things that we don't know. And secondly, that his willingness to die is connected to his blind faith, and yet at the same time it's a death that could lead toward a dead end because of him so blindly believing. And then back to the issue of voluntarism, choice, will, commitment, decision on behalf of Neo.
And it plays on both sides, as you were saying. His blind faith, she speaks about it almost like she pities him because he is a dogmatic, true believer. But she also says, without him, we're all lost. In other words, sometimes blindness is necessary to get something done.
Absolutely.
If you knew all of the ins and outs, you'd hesitate.
That's what the Wachowski sees so clearly, this human sense of being caught between, on the one hand, the need to believe, and on the other hand, a suspicion of what we believe, and yet having to live in between and betwixt and between that need on the one hand and the suspicion on the other.
Right. And when you say she knows things, boy, that's only the beginning of it. And we don't want to run too far ahead here, but you have to point out the richness of the interpretive scheme here. What we will find out starting in part 2, Neo talks to her the first time in part 2, and he says, okay, wait a minute, you're not human, are you? She goes, nope. He goes, wait a minute, you're a program. She says, yep. So all of a sudden, in the first part here, it seems it's very Manichaean again. She's good. Everything in the Matrix is bad. She's going to help you get out. Everything out is good. By part 2, all of a sudden, she's actually representative of the machines in the Matrix, in the mind. She's a program. That's where it starts to become so unbelievably multidimensional, because things are not what they appear.
And that's where the Manichaean expectations began to be called into question.
Break down, exactly.
You see, they begin to break down.
Very
You see,
much.
most of the American public, they can't take it. They're banking on this Manichaean project. And yet I think as the years unravel and unfold, we'll see, especially after Iraq and some other political situations that make it difficult for Americans to hold on to Manichaean conceptions of themselves, that they're going to be forced to be more Socratic. And lo and behold, we'll begin to see the Socratic energy of the film itself. So there's a sense in which, as you say before, we can't jump to 2 and 3, but 2 and 3 is kind of waiting for America in the next 5 to 10 years as America has to confront itself for what it really is.
As humans have to do it. The Manichaean impulse is east, west, north, south. The Iraqis have it just as much as Americans do. They're very black and white.
Absolutely.
Very black and white.
Absolutely. It's just when you see it black and white and you're the empire in the driver's seat, that's one thing to be black and white and you're basically being subjugated and still engaging in, cowardly gangster activity against the empire. So there's a sense in which the epic of our time, Matrix, is wrestling with the challenges of our time, American empire in the driver's seat, and having to be...
the Oracle was saying that one of them had to die, and again, the theme of life and death goes through all 3 of them. Somebody has to die in all of them. Even Trinity is going to get involved, and it's a very complex issue again. Obviously, we'll circle back to that. Don't want to get into it right now, but we're about to face the issue with... And that glitch... That deja vu glitch.
Here come the repressive forces again. Here they are again. Always waiting to be summoned. Can't talk about the Matrix without talking about repressive power behind authorities.
On both exterior and interior, as we were saying, exterior oppression is horrible, but it's also obvious.
That's right.
Interior repression and oppression, where you secretly choose forms of unfreedom as a way to stifle yourself, that's
Absolutely.
another form of enslavement, interior enslavement, that is part of what the Matrix is about as well.
Absolutely. Well, it's like Marx on the one hand and Foucault on the other. Marx talks about structural dominations on the outside, labor and what have you. Foucault, how subjects are subjugated.
The whole Frankfurt School of Marcuse and Horkheimer and Adorno and Jürgen Habermas, I think is one of the world's really great living philosophers. We're studying how oppression, both external and internal, came into being. The external oppression is the Marxist view, where structural forms of techno-economic modes can enslave people, and obviously enslavement itself, literal slavery, is a form of that. Freud, which was the second one they were trying to integrate Freud and Marx, is all the forms of unfreedom that we do when we repress ourselves internally. And so they wanted a whole system of liberation based on what, if we examine the forms of repression and unfreedom that both Freud and Marx looked at. And that's
that issue of good news, bad news. Potential messianic figure.
Exactly. Good news could be gospel.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think one swerve, again, Wachowski brothers would make, though, let's say from Freud, who envisions the move from excessive neurosis to normal unhappiness, so that the highest one can actually achieve is a certain kind of unhappiness after one deals with one's excessive neuroses.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the Wachowski brothers do present a possibility of a certain kind of mental emancipation that's shot through with skepticism, but skepticism doesn't have the last word, and there's some glimpse of a joy that's not reducible simply to just unhappiness. So the dark side of Freud, I think, is something that they wrestle with, but wouldn't want to end with. And I think as we move to 2 and 3, we'll see
that, yeah.
The ways in which joy tends to be associated with a much more secular discourse, like the end of Beethoven's Ninth, where the voice pierces through instrumental absolute music, because the highest form of human emancipation tends to be more joy and solidarity with others, as opposed to a salvation in another world or a salvation that's far removed from interaction with horizontal relations with others. But
Agent Smith, you're the same.
L. Smith.
That's great, and you are.
There is a school of thought, associated with C-Jack and other postmodern theorists who argue that Judas is indispensable for messiahs, that you actually have to have persons who are willing to betray in the name of a lower ideal in order for your higher ideal to have weight and gravity. And when you see that confrontation between Morpheus, true believer, and dogmatist investing his all in the one, capital O, confronted with Judas, capital J almost here, you can see that there's a sense in which they need each other. They're almost dependent on each other, that one derives the force of what they stand for from one another. And I think in Matrix 2 and 3, with the unsettling of salvation narratives and the unsettling of messianic stories, you begin to see how the binary opposition between a Messiah and a Judas actually go hand in hand.
There's an internal correlate of that. One of the really great researchers of child development, Margaret Mahler, extensively looked at evidence about what happens when children repress certain desires, certain impulses, certain aspects of themselves. And the easy and simple answer is, well, they have oppressive parents or an oppressive culture or so on. And nobody's denying that. But it didn't account for the data, because they would look at certain infants that had very loving and caring parents, and the infants could, on many occasions, still be very repressed internally. And others had just horrible parents, but the kids could rise above it. She concluded a very sensitive survey saying the lion's share of repression rests with the infant. Now, what that tells us, and again, it's not denying other forms, what I find so fascinating about Cypher is,
Well, like you said, Brother Ken, this is betrayal for a little peace of mind.
little illusory piece of mind instead of pieces of silver.
Exactly.
And right here you've got, male sexuality is so wonderfully off the wall. On the one hand, it can be, terrific and loving and caring. On the other hand, it is unendingly creepy. And what we see right here is like one step away from necrophilia. He's just there slobbering over a body that for all intent and purposes is dead, and certainly not inhabited, at least at this point, by a mind. And look at him, he's just drooling over it.
And that dualism that we see in this film now, in which the real body is an object of desire.
Yep.
And yet his desire is quite authentic, I think. He deserves more attention than he gets.
Yeah.
I mean, he reminds me of the figures in The Iceman Cometh of Eugene O'Neill. Well, they choose to live in a world of drunkenness. They choose addiction because they're fundamentally convinced that the claims about salvation and redemption are themselves illusions. So it's Harry Hope's saloon, as if it's a site of hope, but it's really the hopelessness that they freely, deliberately choose. And O'Neill, in a way, is forcing us, really,
to confront that.
To confront the possibility that the very things that we view as piercing illusion is itself an illusion. The same kind of skeptical.
Not like this. It's such a great line.
See, that seems to be a vindication and confirmation of Neo's messianic status. And you can see why people would fall into the Manichaean view that's pervasive among other such cyber thrillers.
And certainly in part one, again, kind of semi-self-contained, apparently simplistic. This whole sequence, again, just in terms of cinematography, I think the whole thing is brilliant. The way it's shot, the way it's edited, it's exquisite in terms of the panoramic views, the special effects. Really amazing.
Oh, it is amazing. Now, but look at those phallic symbols of the culture, of the empire. The skyscrapers, hard, straight, penetrating. What a critique that we'll see of such a imperial mentality. I mean, this notion of a post-human civilization that emerges out of the experiment with Homo sapiens for the 40,000 years or so that we've had our chance to do our thing. And how, in fact, religion as the major forms of human beings trying to make sense of the world have, in fact, been obsessed with suffering and misery. You think of part 10 of Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion, one of the great moments in which reflection upon the problem of evil, unjustified suffering, unnecessary social misery, and so on. And that the critique that the post-humans make of the humans actually makes some sense, even though it's not as if what they have to offer is desirable or appealing to we humans, as it were, who are sitting here watching the post-human civilization emerge out of our creation. There's an interesting kind of dialogue here that is actually quite a serious and substantive one.
And it's also in the context of the Matrix trilogy. Remember, nothing's quite what it seems as this unfolds. Yes. And when Agent Smith says tomorrow is our time, looking back on it, one of the meanings of that is that there's going to be a whole change in the relationship between Zion, the Matrix, and the machines as they actually begin to integrate due to what Neo does to some extent. And it can be read here as not just post-human per se, but as post-alienation. which is what the three realms are now. They're all at each other's throats. And that's going to change over the course of the second and third. And so we're also getting some hints about it from that dimension.
Is it, you think, is it post-alienation, or is it the expectations that the post-human can do a better job in dealing with and possibly overcoming alienation, but falling prey to the same illusions that most religious efforts to deal with alienation tend to do? One wonders, what's going on with the Wachowski brothers in this regard, because, there's a possible misanthropy here. We can go back to Jonathan Swift and some of the other real satirical treatments of the human condition, in which you end up, later Mark Twain's like this too, you end up just talking about the damned human race, right? And yet, what alternative does one have? And if the alternative is this postmodern civilization, they look like, the gangsters I grew up with. So it's not as if they're making some radical break, as it were. So what? It's interesting. John the Baptist, Jesus, and Lazarus all wrapped together here. It's fascinating. Sacrifice generate new possibilities.
This is one of the great themes, I think, throughout the whole trilogy, is that the one, the Savior, really is androgynous in the best sense, or bisexual. It's really Neo and Trinity. They together do it. And it's a very, very high icon in most of the great religious traditions, East and West, certainly in Buddhism and Vedanta and the Neoplatonic tradition. In Dzogchen Buddhism, for example, the highest image is a man and a woman in sexual union, representing yin and yang, or Shiva and Shakti. And it's the two of them together really doing it all the way up through the third film. And I think it's very, very telling that in that sense it's the yin and yang between the two of them. It's another thing that you were talking about, that the Wachowskis really have a very serious interest in inclusivity.
And she's making a decision. This is woman's authority here. But he still has that questioning attitude. That journey to the interior, as it were, and he begins to raise questions. Am I really the one? Am I not a garden variety messianic wannabe who's just human like everybody else? You know what I mean?
Don't you think all real liberators and messiahs ask that question, why have thou forsaken me? They really don't have that absolute certainty that they're the one. The people with dogma around them are all certain they're the one. I don't know a single Buddha or Lao Tzu or Jesus that didn't have profound doubts about that. And of course you have to have those kinds of doubts.
But Neo has it before he's on the cross. See, Jesus raises that blues question while he's being crucified. You see what I mean?
But don't you think that Jesus, when he's getting tapped early on, and don't you think
Even
he's sitting there
early.
saying, wait a minute, I'm the one? Wait a minute, you mean my dad is Jehovah?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
yeah.
Seriously?
Well, one wonders about that. It's a good question. But is it true in the Buddhist tradition that Buddha himself questions himself
There's
as to whether
always
he has any?
the 6 years of temptation, and Mara, am I really doing it? He didn't know what was going on. It really is and that whole point about being both human and divine is that you're 100% of both. So you're 100% divine, or you realize the ground of being, but you're also 100% human. You have desires, you have doubts, you have those kinds of things. And I think that's the richness of the Word made flesh.
Word made flesh. I wonder whether the Wachowski brothers are really closer to Chekhov here, which is to say that the questioning is so radical that the very possibility that one can have messianic aspirations is itself.
That's another very important point. I'll just say it very briefly. The machines want to get free too. The agents want to get free too. Everybody is trapped in this thing because these realms are all alienated, and part of the trilogy is how they all get redeemed, at least to some degree, including Agent Smith. That's what's so fascinating. He's telling you right there, I hate this place. I'm not free in this place.
And
that's a shocking statement.
He's echoing the sentiments of many, many humans themselves. The world created by Homo sapiens is one in which oftentimes we often say, I want to get the hell out of here.
Get
me out of space and time. Get me out of this predicament, this prison.
Yes, think about it, even in the theological terms you were mentioning. It's not just that the humans in the Matrix are, quote, fallen. The agents in the Matrix, the machines in the Matrix, are in a fallen world too. They're all going to have...
There's your point about how they're inextricably intertwined together.
Yeah. Beautiful. Oh, that's just aesthetically, that's so remarkable.
That's powerful. Fire and rain.
Find them and destroy them.
Oh, I love it.
That's tough too, boy. That's tough.
It's another one of those great cinematic moments. Look at that.
Absolutely. This thing.
Oh, and the whole camera work going around on the trolley like that. Oh, it's just
This
exquisite.
turning point in the history of modern cinema here.
Just wonderful.
Unbelievable.
So she's learning to do that.
Let's go.
Right before he did his trick, though, he turned to her and said, "Trinity, help me." They are in it together. There's no
They are
question.
in it together.
Yep. I think great shot. All of this again, just terrific. And it's so there. I mean, it throws you right in the midst of this, and yet keeps coming up. Get up with these incredible shots. It's a real turning point because remember, particularly in the context of part one, Neo is still stepping into the fact that he might be the one.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
And he's already shown some indication of being able to move as fast as he is, but it's still not quite decided. And one of the great things about, I think, how the Wachowskis played this is they keep saying, oh, yes, he is the one. Then the Oracle says, no, he's not. Sort of, no, you're not. And then, yes, he is, no, he isn't. Yes, he is, no, he isn't.
Back and forth.
So
back
they're
and
still
forth.
keeping a suspense going here, which is just, really remarkable. They're all such original angles. They're all such original perspectives on how to shoot something like that.
Talking about being dependent on the other.
Yeah, yeah.
My God.
This is the telling moment, and of course he's doing it for Trinity. And it's like, okay, if he can do this, that is so well done.
That juxtaposition, you see, of fire and rain, fire and rain.
But there's that part of all of us that is so happy to think that he could be.
Absolutely.
It's so great. It's like Trinity's so far ahead of these lame guys. She's known this stuff for an hour and a half. They're kind of... Boy, the action sequences in the last 30, well, they're great throughout this, but the last 30, 35 minutes of part one, it was one new scene after another, things we'd never seen before in cinema. And boy, when Agent Smith and Neo go at it here in the subways, another unbelievable sequence.
Another historic moment.
Oh, man.
Another historical moment. Just like Cypher told him, you're going to have to run.
But here's the choice. Here's the choice point.
Mr. Anderson rather than Neo, you see.
Mm-hmm.
That dual identity. He chooses the everyday quotidian identity.
Well, it's an important point because actually Agent Smith and Neo get liberated together. So he's trying to wipe out Mr. Anderson. That's another subtle clue.
That will come back. Jesus, he's killing him. Messianic figure being key. Gesture of Morpheus now.
Yeah.
See, that theme of fate comes back again.
Okay. Give the running part a try now.
Let me try that running now. Cypher was right.
Yeah. Bringing all these factors together just in sheer terms of action in the last couple of minutes here is great because you got all these tensions. They've got the Sentinels coming at them. You've got all this internal stuff that has to go on. You still got the confrontation with Agent.
Always a believer, see. 303, back to Trinity. The power within that number.
It's a great horse race, though. It is just right down to the finish line, and it is neck and neck.
But you're so right, though, Brother Ken. You can see so many different
They're inside.
struggles going on different fronts and setting the scene for Matrix 2.
Yeah, definitely.
The weave for all these various fronts together in some way.
Yep.
There's 303.
On the face of it, that doesn't look good.
He looked
But
like he's in deep
it's the
trouble.
face of it.
You see that look of disbelief on his face?
That was wonderful. It's hard. It's like, who's more devastated, the one who loves him or the one who's the true believer?
Exactly. Morpheus' whole world is being shattered. How much can one Neo take? Look at that face.
Yeah. Obviously, again, they're in it together, but it's the reverse of the Sleeping Beauty. She kisses him and brings him back. Another gender-bending moment here, which is really important, I think.
Still that power of love theme that
Yeah.
goes back to almost all love.
Now get up.
Powerful.
That's the beginning of him seeing subtle energy lines. That's going to happen a lot in part 2 and part 3 and is really important in terms of his own awakening, I think. This is an important moment because at part 2, Smith comes out and said, somehow you and I became one to some extent. When Neo enters him, that's why they're also very much tied together in their own awakening. And he tries to explain this at the beginning of part 2. He is changed by what just happened there. That's a really important moment.
That's a very interesting point you make there.
Great images, just wonderful images. They are so in this together.
No, but again, this roll of arrows that we'd mentioned before is going to come back with real power.
And look at that. That is so... everything is set up.
Matrix 1.
Brother Cornel, I mean, all of the things are in place for part 2 and part 3. We talked about if you just look at part 1 by itself, well, it's a brilliant movie for many, many reasons. People can pick at it artistically and so on for minor complaints, but boy, as a self-contained part 1, it's exquisite. And partly because so many people will overlook those very subtle cues and clues. I know I did the first time I saw it, and read it as that kind of Manichaean situation where it's sort of everything in the Matrix is bad, everything out of the Matrix is good, everything in it is enslaved, everything out of it is free. But all of a sudden, when you get into part 2, and we'll be going into this, you have all of these things start jumping out at you. The Oracle is actually a program. You find out sooner or later that the machines themselves, as Neo says, if you could only see Machine City like I do, it's light, it's made of light. And light and energy represents spirit in this trilogy. So all of a sudden these things start having an incredibly complex and rich interpretation to them. So one of the things that I enjoy about the trilogy is you can watch part 1 and there it is. It's a fairly, relatively simple story, although we pointed out some of those clues in it. Agent Smith wants to get free of it. The Oracle is making certain statements and so on. But boy, by the time you get into part 2 and part 3, we're dealing with 3-dimensional chess. It's a rich, multi-dimensional interpretive piece of art. And that's what I think moves it from being a simple sort of science fiction movie to a piece of complex literature that can be interpreted in so many different levels and dimensions.
Absolutely. I think what we have here in this first installment was a historic effort to fuse the philosophic, the mythic, the religious, and the political in a new kind of cinematic form of expression that was cutting edge special effects and so on. And that kind of fusion that has this kind of synoptic vision and an analysis of so many different levels of lived experience in contemporary market-driven life, and yet at the same time still a preoccupation with the old big questions.
Yeah.
Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the meaning of life? How do we talk about hope? how ought we to treat each other? These are the perennial questions that every human being who makes the moves from womb to tomb has to come to terms with.
Right.
And I think it's still open-ended. It's incomplete. You're absolutely right. It gives the impression of being Manichaean, and yet it's much more complicated than that. And yet I think in the end, too, it's going to come down fundamentally to the choices that we human beings still